Welcome back to another episode of Dr. D's Philosophy and Critical Thinking course. In this video, we are going to discuss philosopher Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy, the first chapter. This, I think, is one of the greatest works in the history of philosophy. It covers a range of different topics and gets right to the sort of core of the issue with respect to all of them. And it's fairly easy to read, I think. Before we get into the content of this chapter, who was Bertrand Russell? So Russell was a British philosopher, mathematician, and logician who did most of his work in the early 20th century. He's known for being one of the most famous early 20th century analytic philosophers. He won a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1950. He was married 4 times. He was arrested twice, both times for pacifism. So on one occasion, he got arrested for participating in an anti-nuclear demonstration. And he was also arrested for opposing World War I. The anti-nuclear demonstration arrest occurred when he was 89 years old. He was a very prolific writer, wrote on a bunch of different topics, and a lot of his writing was just for ordinary people, for common people, wasn't necessarily for other academic philosophers. So in that sense, his writing is quite accessible as far as it goes. All right, so let's talk about this first chapter in this book. First chapter is called Appearance and Reality, and Russell opens things up here by asking the question, is there any knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable man could doubt it? Then he says, this question, which at first sight might not seem difficult, is really one of the most difficult that can be asked. All right, so is there knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable man could doubt it? What he's going to do in this chapter is offer examples of what seems to be very basic knowledge that we all have, knowledge that we acquire through perception. So through seeing things or hearing things, touching, tasting, smelling things. It's quite natural to think that perception is just a basic way of coming to know about the world. Now, he's going to raise some doubts about the idea that we can know anything through perception at all. So let's talk about some of the basis for doubt here. Russell begins with an example of the table. Right? So you take a table that you're looking at. Suppose we're looking at just this white table, this rectangular table in front of us. And Russell asks the question, well, what can we know about it through perception? Well, what does perception tell us? Perception tells us first that the table has a white color. And if we focus on what our perception is like, we don't seem to see a rectangle per se. So when I look at the table from this angle, if the table's over there, the very near corner to me appears to be obtuse or greater than 90 degrees. Whereas the angle of the table off to the side over there appears to be more acute, so like less than 90 degrees, if I'm really focusing on what my perception of the table is like. Now, we all know that rectangles have 4 90-degree angles. And what Russell's saying here is, well, the angles don't appear to be 90 degrees if we really focus on what our perception's like. So he gives a very helpful analogy here. He says, imagine a painter who is trying to paint the table on a canvas. They can't just paint like one very obvious rectangle on the canvas. That's not going to look like the real table. The painter would have to pay attention to what their perception is really like in order to get an accurate representation of that table onto the canvas. And so the painter would pay attention to this fact about their perception, namely that the table does not appear to have 4 90-degree angles when they're looking at it. The painter is also going to be sensitive to the different shades of color that seem to be distributed across the table. So when we say, that table's white, well, does it really appear white in perception? No, certain areas appear to be more or less a darker shade of gray, maybe a lighter shade of gray, depending on how the light's hitting the table. It might appear to be a little bit yellow or golden in certain areas. Right? So it doesn't appear to be like uniform white across the table. And yet we say, well, no, the table really is just one color. All right, so what's going on here? What's going on here is Russell thinks that just focusing on what our perception's like gives us good reason to think that what we say is true of the table, namely that it's rectangular, that it's white, is not something that we necessarily come to know directly through perception, but rather is something that we arrive at after making an inference based on how things seem to us. So he's going to introduce some technical language here. It's not too difficult to understand what he's talking about, but he's going to call what the experience or the perception presents us with, or in other words, what we are directly aware of when we look out into the world, sense data. He calls that sense data. So sense data are things like colors, shapes, textures, sounds, these kind of sensory features or qualities. Those are sense data. We can distinguish, though, between the sense data and then what he's going to call a physical object. So something like the table would be a physical object. And the basic point of focusing on what his perception is like, paying close attention to what his perception's like, the point of doing that is to draw this distinction between what we directly know in experience or in perception, namely the sense data, and then what we say is like really out there in the world, namely this real physical object, the table. These are two different things. Now, once we have that distinction in place, we can appreciate that there's this difference between appearance and reality. So what we're directly aware of in perception is just an appearance of the table, the way the table looks, the way the table feels. But then we tend to think that in addition to the appearance, there's also an underlying reality that's there, namely the real physical object itself that has its features presumably independently of the way it appears to us. So there's the appearance and then there's the reality. All right, so to continue on this line of thought, we're focusing on the table still. We were just talking about the color of the table, the shape of the table, but notice you can also do this, this sort of like activity and thought that Russell's engaged in with respect to things like the texture of the table. Right? So what does the texture of the table feel like? Or you could say that a texture is something that you could see too. It looks smooth. And Russell says, well, the texture of the table might look smooth from our current vantage point or perspective, but if we were to look at the table under a microscope, we might say that it looks like it has valleys or mountains. Right? It looks very rough. You can imagine being like a very small ant walking across the table, and the ant might seem to see a bunch of hills and valleys on what to the naked human eye appears to be just a smooth surface. All right, so what's the real texture of the table? Well, Russell's point here seems to be the table can appear to have different textures to different perceivers. So the texture is again on the side of appearance rather than reality. The texture might not necessarily be some kind of intrinsic or inherent property or feature of the table itself. Rather, it's what he's calling a sense data. Right? A sense datum being something that corresponds more to the way things appear rather than to the reality. All right, so all of this is quite obviously deeply philosophical. And what does Russell end up saying here? Well, what he's doing in this first chapter is more of paying close attention to what perception's like and then raising the question, can we know what real physical objects are like? Can we know that they even exist at all? There are, of course, other possibilities here. So he surveys some of these other possibilities. In addition to what we might just call like physicalism, there's a real physical table out there, there are other possibilities. So it could be, for instance, that what we call the table is actually something that depends for its existence on our minds. The table depends in some way on perceivers around it. So Russell talks about an earlier philosopher named George Berkeley, who was an 18th century philosopher who endorsed a view called idealism. Idealism being the view that all that really exists are minds and their ideas. And that's it. There are no mind-independent objects. There are no physical objects that exist independently of minds or perceivers. So that's a live possibility, given everything Russell said in the first chapter. It could also be that our current scientific picture of the world is closer to the truth. Closer, that is, than something like idealism. So what does science say? Well, science says that the table is just a kind of vast collection of electric charges in violent motion. It's like very small particles, we might say, a collection of electrons or something like that, or the very basic level, really just a kind of charge, for instance. That could be what the table is. Well, notice that, electric charges, they don't have colors, they don't have textures, they don't have shapes, right? They don't smell any particular way. So if science is correct, then it looks like what really exists out there in the world is certainly not what we seem to see or what we seem to smell or seem to hear. According to science, what really exists out there in the world is totally different from the way things appear to us in perception. All right, so just to kind of recap what's going on in this first chapter here, Russell's drawing a distinction between appearance and reality. On the side of appearance, we have sense data, or things like sensory features, smells, tastes, textures, sounds. And then reality. Reality would be things like, real physical object. And when we pay close attention to our perception, we can see that what we're immediately or directly aware of in perception is not a physical object. Rather, it's sense data. And in order to know anything at all about the physical object, we would have to make an inference from what our sense data are like. We would have to draw a conclusion that there's some kind of real physical object on the basis of what our sense data are like. We might ask the question, is that a good inference? So as you can see, there's a deep philosophical issue here. And again, Russell, just to go back to this original question that he asks right at the beginning of this chapter, where he asks, is there any knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable man can doubt it? We can see that what seemed to be such an obvious thing, namely that we can know that there's a real physical table right in front of us, on further inspection seems to be something that we maybe don't actually know. And he's given us just kind of ordinary reasons that we can all appreciate for raising this kind of skepticism about whether we can know that there are physical objects.